The sun-scorched streets of Gila Bend, Arizona Territory, fell silent as Cora Zimmerman stood before the town council, her voice unwavering despite the sea of scowling faces that surrounded her. It was 1885, and she had committed what the elders of this dusty frontier settlement considered an unforgivable sin. She had spoken openly about love in a time and place where a woman's heart was expected to be as tightly bound as her corset. "Miss Zimmerman," Mayor Hollister's voice boomed across the town hall, the gavel in his hand poised like a weapon. "This council finds your continued expressions to be indecent and corrupting to the moral fabric of our community. You have 1 week to vacate Gila Bend." Cora's chin lifted, her auburn hair catching the late afternoon sun that slanted through the windows. At 22, she had already endured more than most women twice her age. Orphaned at 16, she had made her way west with nothing but determination and a small leather-bound journal filled with poetry. "On what grounds am I to be banished?" she asked, her voice clear and steady despite the trembling of her hands hidden in the folds of her simple blue dress. The mayor's mustache twitched with irritation. "You know perfectly well, Miss Zimmerman, your writings about personal matters of the heart distributed to impressionable young women. Your public readings encouraging romantic notions outside the bonds of proper courtship. This is not Boston or New York. In Gila Bend, we maintain standards of decency." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Cora scanned the faces merchants who had welcomed her custom, women who had smiled at her in church, men who had tipped their hats in greeting now turned cold and judgmental. Only Mrs. Peterson, the widow who had rented Cora the small room above her dry goods store, looked away in shame. "I have broken no law," Cora said. "Love is not indecent. Poetry is not corruption." "The decision is final," Mayor Hollister declared, bringing down the gavel with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. 1 week, Miss Zimmerman. Then the sheriff will escort you to the stage if you have not already departed." The crowd began to disperse, some casting backward glances at the young woman who stood alone before the council table. Cora gathered her shawl around her shoulders and walked with measured steps toward the door, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. As she stepped into the harsh Arizona sunlight, a tall figure leaned against the hitching post outside the hall. Dust-covered boots, worn denim, a weathered leather vest, and a hat pulled low, she had noticed him around town over the past few weeks, but had never spoken to him. The stranger straightened as she approached, and for the first time she got a clear look at his face, sun bronzed and serious, with eyes the color of a summer storm. "Miss Zimmerman?" His voice was deep but gentle, like distant thunder. "I couldn't help overhearing." "Seems to me this town's about to lose its only touch of grace." Cora paused, studying him. "And you are Daniel Xavier," he said, removing his hat in a gesture that seemed both courteous and somehow defiant. "I run cattle on the North Range." "Mr. Xavier, I appreciate your concern, but as you heard, my situation is decided." He replaced his hat, adjusting it against the glare of the sun. "What I heard was a bunch of scared old men trying to silence something they don't understand." He glanced back at the town hall. "They banished you for speaking love. Apparently, women aren't meant to have opinions on such matters, let alone express them in verse," she replied with a hint of bitterness. Daniel Xavier's mouth curved into a slow smile that transformed his weathered face. "Then speak it every day," he said simply. "Just maybe not here." Cora looked at him sharply, unsure if he was mocking her. "I mean it," he continued. "There's a settlement forming near my ranch, Copper Springs. No council, no mayor, just people trying to make their way. They could use someone who remembers there's more to life than just surviving it. You're suggesting I simply start over among strangers who haven't already decided who you ought to be." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This fell from your book last week outside the general store. I've been meaning to return it." Cora took the paper, recognizing one of her poem's lines about how the desert blooms after rain, how love can flourish in the most unforgiving places. "You rate it," she said, not a question but an accusation. "I did." Daniel nodded, unashamed. Read it 3 times, in fact, made me see this land differently. He gestured toward the vast expanse beyond the town limits. Made me remember why I came out here in the first place. Something in his honest admission caught Cora off guard. Most men in Gila Bend treated her writing as a peculiar hobby at best, a moral failing at worst. The stage to Copper Springs leaves tomorrow at dawn, Daniel said. I'll be on it, heading back after delivering my cattle. Should you decide to join the journey, I'd be honored to ensure you arrive safely. Before she could respond, he touched the brim of his hat in farewell and strode toward the livery stable, his long shadow stretching behind him on the dusty street. That evening, as Cora packed her meager belongings into a single trunk, Mrs. Peterson knocked timidly on her door. "I've brought you some provisions for your journey," the older woman said, placing a basket on the small table. "I'm sorry about the council's decision. I should have spoken up." Cora sighed, setting down the book she had been wrapping in a shawl. "It wouldn't have made any difference, Mrs. Peterson. Their minds were made up long before today." "Where will you go?" the widow asked, genuine concern in her lined face. "There's a settlement called Copper Springs," Cora replied, surprised at how resolute she suddenly felt. "I've heard they might be more accepting there," Mrs. Peterson nodded. "I've heard of it. Mostly miners and ranchers, but growing. They say there's even talk of a school." She hesitated, then added, "Was it that tall rancher who told you, the one they call the Copper King's Cowboy, Daniel Xavier?" "Yes, do you know him?" "Only by reputation. He manages the biggest spread near Copper Springs, owned by some eastern mining magnate. They say he's fair to his men and honest in his dealings." Mrs. Peterson's expression softened. "And unmarried, despite half the eligible women in 3 counties setting their caps for him." Cora felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm not seeking a husband, Mrs. Peterson. Just a place where I can exist without being considered a corruption." The older woman smiled kindly. "Of course, dear, but a friend on the frontier is worth more than gold, and he seems to have offered you that much at least." After Mrs. Peterson left, Cora removed the leather journal from her trunk and opened it to a blank page. By the light of a single oil lamp, she began to write, pouring out her anger, her fear, and finally, her cautious hope. Perhaps in Copper Springs, she would find what had eluded her in Gila Bend a place to belong. Dawn broke over the eastern mountains in streaks of crimson and gold as Cora arrived at the stage depot. Her trunk had been delivered earlier by one of Mrs. Peterson's sons, and she carried only a small satchel containing her journal, a change of clothes, and the provisions Mrs. Peterson had provided. The stagecoach stood ready, a sturdy Concorde model with its distinctive yellow wheels. The driver was checking the harness on the 4-horse team while a shotgun messenger loaded mail bags into the boot. Daniel Xavier was already there, speaking with the driver. He wore the same dusty clothes as the day before, though he had added a long duster coat against the morning chill. When he saw Cora, something like relief crossed his face. "Miss Zimmerman," he greeted her, crossing the short distance between them, "I'm glad you decided to come." "It seems I have little choice," she replied, still uncertain about this drastic change in her circumstances. Daniel's expression grew serious. "There's always a choice, even when the options aren't what we'd wish for." The driver called for passengers to board, interrupting their conversation. Daniel helped Cora up the iron step into the coach, then followed her inside. 2 other passengers were already seated, a silver-haired gentleman who introduced himself as Dr. Thomas Whitman, bound for the mining camp at Copper Springs, and a young woman named Eliza Perkins, traveling to join her brother who had established a mercantile there. As the stage lurched forward, beginning the 2-day journey across the desert, Cora found herself studying Daniel Xavier surreptitiously. Despite his rough appearance, there was an air of quiet confidence about him, a sense that he knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. It was a quality she envied. "Have you lived in Copper Springs long, Mr. Xavier?" Dr. Whitman asked, breaking the silence that had settled over the passengers. 5 years, Daniel replied. "Came out from Texas after the war looking for open country. Found it along with copper deposits that brought the mining company. been managing their ranch operations ever since. And the town, what's it like? Cora couldn't help asking. Daniel considered before answering, growing, rough around the edges but honest. The mining company owns most everything, but they're not the worst bosses. Let people go about their business as long as the copper keeps flowing. He glanced at Cora. No town council yet, though there's talk of organizing some local government. Let's hope they're more enlightened than Gila Bend's, she said. If not, we'll just have to change their minds, Daniel replied with that same slow smile that transformed his face. The journey was grueling. The stagecoach bounced and jolted over the rough terrain, stopping only at isolated way stations to change horses and allow passengers brief respites for meals and necessary breaks. By the time they made camp for the night, every muscle in Cora's body ached. As she sat before the small fire the driver had built, wrapped in her shawl against the desert night's sudden chill, Daniel joined her, offering a tin cup of coffee. "It gets easier," he said quietly. "The journey, I mean, does it, I wonder?" She wasn't talking about the stagecoach ride, and from the thoughtful look he gave her, Daniel knew it. "Why poetry?" he asked after a moment. "Of all the things to dedicate yourself to out here, why that?" Cora looked into the dancing flames. "Because it's true," she finally answered. "Because when I write about the way the light breaks over the mountains or how love can burn hotter than the desert sun, I'm telling the truth as I see it. And truth matters, Mr. Xavier, even out here, maybe especially out here where life can be so harsh." "Daniel," he said. "If we're going to be neighbors in Copper Springs, you might as well call me Daniel," she nodded. "And I'm Cora." "Well, Cora, I think Copper Springs could use some truth-telling." He stood, dusting off his pants. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow's ride will be just as long, and the trail gets rougher before it gets better." The next day brought them deeper into mining country. The landscape changed from flat desert to rocky hills dotted with scrub pine and twisted juniper. By late afternoon, the stagecoach descended into a narrow valley where Copper Springs sprawled alongside a creek that glinted in the waning sunlight. Unlike Gila Bend's neat grid of streets, Copper Springs had grown organically, buildings clustered along the creek and spreading up the hillsides. The mining company's operations dominated the north end of town, a smelter with its tall chimney belching smoke, offices, and warehouses. The south end looked more like a typical frontier settlement, with a main street lined by false-fronted buildings. "Home, sweet home," Daniel murmured as the stage rolled down the main street, which was simply called Front Street according to the weathered sign. Cora took it all in the saloon with its swinging doors, the general store, a small church, what appeared to be a newspaper office, and various other establishments. People moved about their business, paying little attention to the arriving stage except for a few curious glances. The coach stopped in front of a two-story building with a sign proclaiming it the Copper Springs Hotel and Dining Room. As Daniel helped Cora down from the coach, a barrel-chested man with an impressive beard hurried from the hotel. "Daniel, didn't expect you back so soon," the man called out. "Cattle drive went well, I take it?" "Smooth as silk, Otto," Daniel replied, shaking the man's hand. "Otto, this is Miss Cora Zimmerman. She's new to Copper Springs. Cora, this is Otto Bergman, owner of the finest establishment in town." "Only hotel in town, he means," Otto said with a hearty laugh. "Welcome to Copper Springs, Miss Zimmerman. We have a room available if you're needing accommodations." "Thank you," Cora said, suddenly aware of how unprepared she was. She had left Gila Bend with no real plan beyond escaping banishment, no arrangements for housing or employment in this new place. As if reading her thoughts, Daniel said, "Miss Zimmerman is a writer, poetry mostly. I was thinking perhaps Mr. Reed at the Copper Springs Sentinel might be interested in her talents." Otto's eyebrows rose with interest. "A writer? Well, Reed's always complaining about doing everything himself at that paper. I'll make sure he hears you're in town." He gestured toward the hotel entrance. "Come on in, Miss Zimmerman. Let's get you settled." As Cora moved to follow Otto, Daniel touched her arm lightly. "I need to report to the ranch, but I'll call on you tomorrow if that's all right. See how you're settling in." "That's very kind, Mr. Daniel. Thank you for your help." He tipped his hat and turned toward a hitching post where a tall bay gelding waited patiently. Cora watched as he mounted with the easy grace of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback, then rode off toward the north end of town. Otto showed Cora to a small but clean room on the second floor of the hotel. Dining room serves breakfast from 6 to 9, lunch at noon, and supper from 5 to 8, he explained. Bathhouses out back ladies' hours are posted on the door. Left alone, Cora sat on the edge of the narrow bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of what she had done. She had left behind everything familiar, however unwelcoming it had become, for a mining town where she knew no one except a cowboy she had met only 2 days ago. But as she unpacked her few belongings, she realized that the knot of tension she had carried in her chest for months had begun to loosen. In Gila Bend, she had always felt watched, judged, her every word and action scrutinized for impropriety. Here, she was just another newcomer in a town full of people who had come to reinvent themselves. That evening in the hotel dining room, Cora met more of Copper Springs residents. Otto's wife, Helena, a brisk, efficient woman with kind eyes, made a point of introducing her to several of the regulars, a young lawyer named William Hayes, the town doctor and his wife, and Elmer Reed, the publisher and sole employee of the Copper Springs Sentinel. "Daniel mentioned you're a writer," Reed said over coffee. He was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. "What sort of writing?" "Poetry, primarily," Cora answered hesitantly, expecting the usual dismissive response, "and some short essays." To her surprise, Reed's face lit up. "Poetry, that's wonderful. The Sentinel needs more than just mining news and cattle prices. Brings a bit of culture to the frontier, you know." He leaned forward eagerly. "Would you consider contributing a weekly column?" "Nothing formal, just your observations on life here, perhaps with some of your poetry included." Yes, I would be interested," Cora said, unable to hide her astonishment. "Though I should warn you, my writing caused some controversy in Gila Bend." Reed waved this away. "Gila Bend is still playing at being a proper eastern town. Copper Springs has no such pretensions. We're too busy building something new." He pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "Come by the office tomorrow morning. We'll discuss the details." As Cora prepared for bed that night, she opened her journal and began to write about her journey, the strangeness of this new place, and the unexpected welcome she had received. For the first time in months, the words flowed freely, without the shadow of censure hanging over her pen. Perhaps, just perhaps, Daniel had been right. Perhaps here she could speak of love and truth and beauty every day without fear of banishment. The next morning, Cora awoke to the sounds of Copper Springs coming to life, the distant clang of metal from the mining operations. Wagon wheels on the street below, voices calling greetings. After a breakfast of hot biscuits and strong coffee in the hotel dining room, she made her way to the Sentinel office. Elmer Reed was already at work, setting type for the next edition. He looked up as the bell above the door jangled, pushing his perpetually sliding spectacles back into place. "Miss Zimmerman, excellent timing. I've just cleared space for your column in this week's paper." He gestured to a small desk near the window. "That can be your workspace whenever you need it. Now, about payment." They quickly came to an arrangement, $2 per column, published weekly. It wasn't much, but combined with the modest savings she had brought from Gila Bend, it would cover her room and board until she could find additional work. "I'll have something for you by tomorrow," Cora promised, already mentally composing her first piece, an introduction to herself and her vision for the column. As she left the newspaper office, she nearly collided with Daniel, who was just raising his hand to open the door. "Cora," he said, surprise and pleasure evident in his voice. "I see you've already found your way to Reed. He's offered me a weekly column," she told him, unable to contain her excitement. "It's not much, but it's a start." "That's wonderful news." His genuine pleasure in her good fortune warmed her. "I was coming to see if you'd like to get better acquainted with Copper Springs. I could show you around, introduce you to a few more folks." The sun was bright overhead, the spring air crisp and clean despite the occasional waft of smoke from the smelter. Cora nodded, falling into step beside Daniel as he guided her down Front Street. "The town's growing fast," he explained as they walked. "When I first came here 5 years ago, there wasn't much more than a few prospectors' shacks and the company office. Now look at it." Copper Springs was indeed a town in transition. Alongside rough-hewn cabins stood newer buildings of sawn lumber and brick. The mining company's influence was evident in the surprisingly orderly layout of the newer sections, and the presence of amenities unusual for a frontier settlement: a small library housed in a corner of the company office, a proper schoolhouse under construction, and even a tiny public garden where Helena Borgman was tending a plot of spring flowers. The company's owner, Alexander Randall, has progressive ideas about building a stable community for his workers, Daniel explained. He believes men work better and stay longer if they have comfortable homes and entertainments beyond the saloon. "And where do you fit into this grand vision?" Cora asked, curious about Daniel's role. "Randall needs beef to feed his miners and horses for his operations. I manage the ranch that provides both, along with growing hay and some vegetables." There was pride in his voice, not boastful but the satisfaction of a man who knows his work has value. They stopped before a small cabin set slightly apart from the main street, with a neat front porch and a corral to one side where several horses grazed. "This is mine," Daniel said. "Nothing fancy, but it suits me." "It's lovely," Cora replied, noting the small touches that made it a home: curtains at the windows, a rocking chair on the porch, flowering vines beginning to climb the front posts. Daniel looked as if he might invite her in, then thought better of it. "There's someone else I'd like you to meet," he said instead, guiding her toward a larger cabin farther down the street. The sign above the door read, "Sarah Blackburn, Dressmaker and Milliner." Inside, they found a comfortable shop with bolts of fabric lining the walls and a large table where a woman in her 30s was cutting a pattern from brown paper. "Sarah," Daniel called, "I've brought someone you should know." The woman looked up, dark eyes assessing Cora quickly before breaking into a warm smile. "About time we got some new blood in this town that isn't carrying a pickaxe or a six-shooter." Sarah Blackburn, Cora soon learned, had come to Copper Springs 3 years earlier after the death of her husband. She had built a thriving business making clothing for the miners' wives and the few single women in town, along with curtains, quilts, and other textile goods. "I've been looking for someone to help in the shop," Sarah said after hearing Cora's story. "Nothing full-time yet, but a few days a week would be a godsend. These mining wives all want the latest fashions now that they're not living in tents, and I can barely keep up with the demand." By the time they left Sarah's shop, Cora had agreed to work 3 afternoons a week, helping with simple sewing tasks and minding the shop when Sarah needed to make house calls for fittings. "You've managed to secure 2 positions in less than a day," Daniel said as they continued their tour. "At this rate, you'll be running Copper Springs by the end of the month," Cora laughed, surprising herself with how light she felt. "Hardly, but it's nice to be valued for what I can do rather than criticized for what I say." As they passed the saloon, a commotion erupted: raised voices, then the crash of breaking glass. A man stumbled through the swinging doors, nearly falling onto the boardwalk. He was followed by a taller figure who grabbed him by the collar and hauled him upright. "You pull a knife in my place again, Harkins, and you won't be walking out," the second man growled, giving the drunk a shove that sent him staggering into the street. Daniel's posture changed instantly, his hand moving to rest near the gun he wore at his hip. "Stay here," he told Cora quietly, moving to intercept the drunk before he could regain his balance. "Problem, Jake?" Daniel called to the man from the saloon. "Nothing I can't handle," Jake replied, noticing Cora for the first time and straightening his vest in a futile attempt at dignity. "Pardon the disturbance, madam." The drunk Harkins swayed on his feet, glaring at Daniel. "Xavier," he slurred. "Always sticking your nose where it don't belong, just like back in Gila Bend." Cora stiffened at the mention of her former home. Daniel's voice remained level, but there was steel beneath the calm. "You're drunk, Harkins. Go sleep it off before you say something you'll regret." "Regret?" Harkins laughed, an ugly sound. Only thing I regret is not being there when they ran that uppity woman out of town. Heard she was corrupting decent folk with her fancy words about love and such nonsense. He spat in the dirt. Women should know their place. Daniel moved so quickly that Cora barely saw. At one moment he was standing relaxed. The next he had Harkins by the front of his filthy shirt, lifting him almost off his feet. "That's enough," Daniel said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Miss Zimmerman is a guest in this town, and you will show her respect or answer to me. Understood?" Harkins' bloodshot eyes widened as he glanced between Daniel and Cora, comprehension slowly dawning through the alcoholic haze. "She's the one, the poet from Gila Bend," he wheezed out a laugh. "Well, ain't that something? Xavier's finally found himself a woman, and it's the one nobody else wanted." Daniel's fist connected with Harkins' jaw, sending the drunk sprawling in the dust. Jake, the saloon keeper, sighed and signaled to two men who had been watching from the doorway. They came forward and dragged the unconscious Harkins away, presumably to the sheriff's office to sleep off his drunk in a cell. "I apologize for that unpleasantness," Daniel said as he returned to Cora's side, flexing his right hand. "Tom Harkins worked for the Bar G Ranch near Gila Bend until they fired him for stealing. He drifts around, causing trouble wherever he lands." "You didn't have to defend me," Cora said, though she was touched by his swift reaction to Harkins' insults. "Yes, I did." Daniel's gaze was steady. "Not because you can't defend yourself, but because that's not how we treat people in Copper Springs. Not if I have anything to say about it." As they resumed their walk, Cora found herself studying Daniel with new eyes. There was more to this quiet cowboy than she had initially assumed: a fierce sense of justice, a willingness to stand up for his principles, and clearly, a past that somehow intersected with her own. "You've been to Gila Bend before," she said as they reached the hotel. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded. "I drive cattle there twice a year for sale. Been doing it since I started working for Randall. But you never mentioned knowing the town when we met." A shadow crossed his face. "Didn't seem relevant at the time. You needed help, not my life story. And now." Cora pressed, sensing there was something he wasn't telling her. Daniel removed his hat, running a hand through hair that had been flattened by the weight of the Stetson. "Now, I think we both could use some honesty." He glanced at the hotel porch where several guests were enjoying the afternoon sun. "But perhaps somewhere more private. Would you join me for supper tomorrow, at my cabin? I'm a decent cook, I promise." Cora hesitated, aware of how such an arrangement might appear to others. But she was no longer in Gila Bend, where every action was scrutinized for impropriety. And something told her that Daniel Xavier was a man she could trust. "I'd like that," she said finally. "What time shall I arrive?" 6 o'clock, and bring your appetite." He smiled, replacing his hat. "Until tomorrow, then." That evening, Cora sat at the small desk in her hotel room, drafting her first column for the Sentinel. She titled it "New Beginnings," and in it, she introduced herself to the people of Copper Springs, explaining her background as a poet and her belief in the power of words to connect people even in the rugged setting of the frontier. She hesitated over whether to mention her banishment from Gila Bend, finally deciding on honesty. If she was to make a new start in Copper Springs, better to have everything in the open from the beginning. "I come to you from Gila Bend," she wrote, "where my poetry about love and human connection was deemed unsuitable for public consumption. But I believe that especially in places where life can be harsh and unforgiving, we need reminders of the beauty and tenderness that make us human. If my words can provide even a moment's respite from the daily struggles of frontier life, then I will have succeeded in my purpose." She concluded with a short poem about desert wildflowers blooming after rain, a metaphor for resilience and unexpected beauty in difficult circumstances. The next morning, she delivered her column to Elmer Reed, who read it on the spot, his expression growing more animated with each paragraph. "This is exactly what the Sentinel needs," he declared, pushing his spectacles up his nose for the dozenth time. "A fresh voice, unafraid to speak truth. The first issue with your column will go out tomorrow morning." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity as Cora helped Sarah Blackburn in the dress shop, learning the layout of the workroom, and being introduced to several customers' miners' wives eager to meet the new woman in town, especially one who wrote poetry. By the time she returned to the hotel to freshen up before her supper with Daniel, Cora was both exhausted and exhilarated. In just 2 days, she had secured lodging, employment, and made more genuine connections than she had in months at Gila Bend. As she changed into her best dress, a deep blue calico with white piping that Sarah had admired earlier, Cora wondered what Daniel wanted to discuss. There was clearly more to his story than he had shared, some connection to her situation that she couldn't yet see. At precisely 6 o'clock, she knocked on the door of Daniel's cabin. He opened it immediately, as if he had been waiting just inside. He had cleaned up, she noticed, wearing a fresh shirt with his usual denim pants, his dark hair still damp from washing. "Right on time," he said, stepping back to allow her entry. "Come in." The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table set for dinner, a few sturdy chairs and shelves holding books, a surprise that made Cora reassess Daniel yet again. A doorway led to what she presumed was a bedroom, and a small kitchen area occupied one corner of the main room, where something savory bubbled in a pot on the stove. "It's not much," Daniel said, suddenly seeming self-conscious, "but it's home." "It's lovely," Cora replied sincerely. Noting the little touches that spoke of care, a colorful woven blanket draped over one chair, a vase of desert wildflowers on the table, the gleam of well-polished wood. Daniel gestured her to the table, where he served a hearty stew of beef and vegetables, accompanied by fresh bread that he admitted had come from Helena Borgman's kitchen at the hotel. "I can manage most things on my own," he explained as they ate, "but baking has always eluded me." The meal was delicious, and the conversation flowed easily. Daniel asked about her first impressions of Copper Springs, and Cora found herself speaking more freely than she had in years, sharing her hopes for what she might accomplish in this new place. It wasn't until they had finished eating and moved to sit before the fire, where Daniel had poured each of them a small glass of whiskey, that he finally addressed the reason for his invitation. "I owe you an explanation," he began, staring into the dancing flames. "About Gila Bend and why I was so quick to suggest you leave." Cora waited, sensing that whatever he was about to share was difficult for him. "I've been driving cattle to Gila Bend for 5 years, as I told you, but what I didn't mention is that 3 years ago I nearly settled there." He took a sip of his whiskey, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "I had met someone, Rebecca Mason. She taught at the school." "I knew Rebecca," Cora said softly. "She left Gila Bend about 2 years ago. There were rumors." Daniel's mouth twisted in a bitter smile. "I'm sure there were. Rebecca was like you in many ways, educated, independent-minded, unwilling to conform just for the sake of appearances. We had planned to marry. I was going to give up my position with Randall and buy a small ranch outside town." He fell silent, and Cora could see the pain of old wounds in his expression. "What happened?" she asked gently. "Rebecca wrote poetry too," he said. "Nothing like yours, more personal reflections, never intended for anyone else to read. But one of her students found her journal and the child's mother read it. The things Rebecca had written about love, about desire." He shook his head. "The town council called it moral corruption and gave her a choice: resign from teaching and never have contact with the town's children again, or leave Gila Bend." Cora's heart ached for him, recognizing the parallel to her own situation. "And she chose to leave. We both did." Daniel's voice was flat. "I told her we could start over somewhere else, but she couldn't bear the shame of it. She broke off our engagement, went back east to her family." He looked directly at Cora now. "When I saw you standing before that same council, hearing those same accusations, I couldn't just ride away. Not again." The pieces fell into place: Daniel's immediate offer of help, his knowledge of Copper Springs as a potential haven, his fierce defense of her against Harkin's insults. It wasn't just kindness to a stranger, it was a kind of redemption, a chance to right a wrong he felt he had failed to prevent 3 years earlier. "I'm sorry about Rebecca," Cora said, but I'm grateful you were there when I needed someone to point the way forward." Daniel set down his glass. "I don't want you to think I helped you because you remind me of her. You're nothing alike, really, except in your courage, but I recognized the injustice, and this time I was determined to do something about it." "Is that why you told me to speak it every day?" Cora asked. "Love, I mean." "Partly," he admitted, "but also because I believe in what you write. The world's hard enough without silencing the voices that remind us of its beauty." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to embers. When Cora finally rose to leave, Daniel walked her to the door. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "For dinner and for your honesty." "Will I see you tomorrow?" he asked. "There's a social at the schoolhouse, nothing fancy, just music and dancing to celebrate the completion of the building." "I'd like that," Cora replied, realizing she meant it. There was something about Daniel Xavier that made her feel understood in a way she had never experienced before. The following day brought the publication of Cora's first column in the Copper Springs Sentinel. As she walked down Front Street toward Sarah's dress shop for her afternoon shift, several people stopped her to comment on her writing A Miner's Wife, who had tears in her eyes as she spoke of how the poem had reminded her of her distant home in Pennsylvania. A grizzled prospector who gruffly admitted that them words about desert flowers had hit the nail on the head. By the time she reached the dress shop, Cora was floating on a cloud of validation. Sarah greeted her with a broad smile and a copy of the paper. "You're the talk of the town," Sarah said. "Reed says he's already had 3 people come in to subscribe to the paper specifically to read your column." "Really?" Cora couldn't hide her delight. "Really? And speaking of making an impression." Sarah gestured to a package on the cutting table. "This is for you from Daniel." The package contained a small leather-bound notebook, similar to the one Cora already used for her poetry but of finer quality, with creamy, unlined pages. A note was tucked inside the cover, for new beginnings and for speaking love every day. That evening, as Cora walked to the schoolhouse social on Daniel's arm, she felt a sense of possibility she had never experienced in Gila Bend. The night air was cool but not cold, scented with juniper and sage. Music drifted from the open doors of the new schoolhouse, where lanterns had been strung to create a festive atmosphere. Inside, it seemed most of Copper Springs had turned out for the celebration. Miners and their families, ranch hands, shopkeepers, and company officials mingled freely, united in pride over this tangible sign of their town's growth and permanence. Otto Bergman, serving as unofficial master of ceremonies, called for everyone's attention. "Before the dancing begins, I'd like to introduce our newest resident, Miss Cora Zimmerman, whose fine writing debuted in the Sentinel today." Applause greeted this announcement, genuine and welcoming, bringing a flush to Cora's cheeks. And Otto continued with a twinkle in his eye, "I hear Miss Zimmerman is also a poet. Perhaps she would honor us with a recitation." Cora froze, memories of the hostile faces in Gila Bend's town hall flashing through her mind. But then she felt Daniel's steady presence beside her, saw the encouraging smiles on the faces around her, and stepped forward. "I'd be honored," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "This is a poem about finding one's voice after silence, about speaking truth even when others would prefer not to hear it." The room fell silent as she recited a poem she had composed just that afternoon in Sarah's shop, inspired by her new beginning in Copper Springs. It spoke of courage and truth, of the power of words to build bridges between hearts, and yes, of love, not just romantic love, but the love that creates community from strangers, that transforms a mining camp into a town where people cared for one another. When she finished, there was a moment of stillness and Cora's heart sank. But then applause erupted, more enthusiastic than before, with calls of bravo and more. Otto wiped a suspicious moisture from his eye, and even the mining company manager, a usually stern man named Peterson, nodded approvingly. As the music struck up again and couples took to the floor for dancing, Daniel leaned close to Cora's ear. "You see. Here you can speak your truth and people will listen." He held out his hand in invitation, and Cora allowed him to lead her into the dance, a simple waltz that she followed easily under his sure guidance. As they circled the floor, she caught glimpses of approving nods from the older women, speculative glances from the younger ones, and the occasional knowing smile exchanged between long-married couples. In Gila Bend, such obvious attention from a bachelor like Daniel would have set tongues wagging with disapproval. Here, it seemed to be accepted as natural, even celebrated. The weeks that followed fell into a pleasant rhythm. Cora's column in the Sentinel gained a following that extended beyond Copper Springs, with subscriptions coming in from neighboring settlements. Her work with Sarah in the dress shop proved satisfying as well, allowing her to earn enough to move from the hotel to a small room behind the shop that Sarah had originally intended as storage space. And then there was Daniel. They spent time together almost daily riding into the hills surrounding Copper Springs, where Daniel taught her the names of plants and animals, sharing meals, attending the occasional social events that marked the community's calendar. Sometimes they simply sat on Sarah's back porch in the evenings, talking or reading in companionable silence. It was during one such evening, about a month after Cora's arrival in Copper Springs, that Daniel finally asked the question that had been hovering unspoken between them. "Are you happy here, Cora?" She looked up from the book she had been reading, considering the question seriously. "Yes," she said finally. "Happier than I thought possible after what happened in Gila Bend. I have work that matters, friends who value me for who I am, and—" She hesitated. "And—" Daniel prompted gently. "And you," she admitted, meeting his gaze directly, "your friendship has meant more to me than I can express." Daniel set aside his own book, turning to face her fully. "Just friendship," Cora's heart quickened. They had been circling this moment for weeks, both aware of the growing connection between them, but neither willing to rush what was developing so naturally. "I think we both know it's more than that," she said softly, "but I've been hesitant to put a name to it, given your history with Rebecca." Daniel reached for her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Rebecca is my past, a painful memory but one I've made peace with." His gray eyes held her steadily. "You, Cora Zimmerman, are very much my present, and if you're willing, I hope you might be my future as well." "Daniel, I'm not proposing marriage," he clarified quickly. "Not yet. That would be rushing things for both of us, but I am asking for your permission to court you properly, with intention and honesty." Cora felt a smile blooming on her face, as warm and bright as the Arizona sun. "I would like that very much." Their first kiss, shared in the soft twilight of Sarah's back porch with the scent of desert sage on the breeze, was everything Cora had ever written about in her poetry, tender, passionate, a communion of souls as much as bodies. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the day you stepped off the stage," he confessed. "I'm glad you waited," Cora replied. "It made it all the more meaningful." As summer bloomed in the high desert, so did their relationship. Daniel began to include Cora in aspects of his work at the ranch, teaching her to ride properly, showing her how the operation functioned. She, in turn, shared more of her poetry with him, including pieces too personal for publication. Their courtship did not go unnoticed in Copper Springs. There were the usual whispers and speculations, but unlike in Gila Bend, the gossip held no malice, only the community's natural interest in a budding romance in their midst. In July, when Copper Springs celebrated Independence Day with a picnic and fireworks provided by the mining company, Daniel and Cora attended as an acknowledged couple. As they watched the colorful explosions light up the night sky, Daniel's arm around her shoulders, Cora reflected on how much her life had changed in just 3 months. "Penny for your thoughts," Daniel murmured against her hair. "I was just thinking about Gila Bend," she admitted. "How what seemed like the worst moment of my life led me here, to you, to all of this." Daniel tightened his arm around her. "Sometimes the things that hurt us most lead us exactly where we need to be." The following week brought an unexpected development. Cora was working in the newspaper office, finishing her latest column, when Elmer Reed burst in, waving a letter excitedly. "You won't believe this," he exclaimed, pushing his eternally sliding spectacles back up his nose. "The Territorial Press Association has nominated your column for an award. Best New Literary Feature in a Frontier Publication." Cora stared at him in disbelief. "That's not possible. I've only been writing for the Sentinel for a few months. 3 months is all it took," Reed said, handing her the letter. "The awards ceremony is in Tucson next month. The association will pay for your travel and accommodations. This is a tremendous honor for the Sentinel for Copper Springs." News of the nomination spread through town like wildfire. By the time Cora finished work that day, it seemed everyone in Copper Springs knew about it. People stopped her on the street to offer congratulations, and when she entered the hotel dining room for supper, she received a spontaneous round of applause from the other diners. Daniel was waiting for her at their usual table, his face alight with pride. "I heard the news," he said, standing to pull out her chair. "Though I'm not surprised, your writing deserves recognition." "I'm still in shock," Cora confessed as she sat down. "I never imagined anyone outside Copper Springs would even read my column, let alone nominate it for an award." "You underestimate yourself," Daniel replied. "Your words touch people, Cora. They always have. That's why they feared you in Gila Bend, because you speak truths that make people feel, and feeling can be dangerous to those who prefer the status quo." Later that evening, as they walked along the creek that gave Copper Springs its name, Daniel broached a subject that had clearly been on his mind. "I'd like to escort you to Tucson for the awards ceremony," he said. "If you'd welcome the company." Cora smiled up at him, touched by the offer. "I'd love that, but can you leave the ranch for that long? Randall owes me some time off," Daniel assured her. "And my foreman, Jenkins, is more than capable of managing things for a week." The journey to Tucson was Cora's first significant travel since coming to Copper Springs. The 3-day stagecoach ride was as grueling as she remembered, but this time, with Daniel beside her, it felt more like an adventure than an ordeal. Tucson itself was a revelation larger and more established than either Gila Bend or Copper Springs, with brick buildings, proper sidewalks, and amenities that reminded Cora of eastern cities she had visited in her youth. The awards ceremony was held in the grand ballroom of Tucson's newest hotel, a 3-story structure with genuine crystal chandeliers and carpeted floors. Editors and publishers from across the Arizona Territory gathered to celebrate the best in frontier journalism, a surprisingly robust community given the challenges of producing newspapers in such remote conditions. When Cora's name was called as the winner in her category, the applause that greeted her approach to the podium was genuine and enthusiastic. She accepted the small silver trophy with hands that trembled slightly, looking out at the sea of faces, mostly men, with a few women among them, all waiting for her to speak. "Thank you," she began, her voice gaining strength as she continued. "When I began writing for the Copper Springs Sentinel, I was a newcomer to the town, having been asked to leave my previous home because my poetry about love and human connection was deemed inappropriate." A murmur ran through the crowd, and she saw a few heads nodding in recognition of such small-town censorship. "In Copper Springs, I found not only acceptance but encouragement to speak my truth through words. This award belongs as much to the people of that town as it does to me, especially to my editor, Elmer Reed, who took a chance on an unknown poet, and to Daniel Xavier, who told me to speak love every day, even when others would silence it." She found Daniel's face in the crowd, his eyes shining with emotion, and drew strength from his steady presence. "On the frontier, we often focus on survival, building shelter, finding water, defending against dangers, but we are more than just survivors. We are dreamers and lovers, poets and builders of community. My column attempts to honor that fuller humanity, and I am deeply grateful that you have found value in it." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and introductions. Several other newspaper editors approached Cora with offers to reprint her columns in their publications, and one publisher from San Francisco suggested she consider compiling her work into a book. It was late when Cora and Daniel finally retired to their separate rooms at the hotel. As they stood in the hallway, Daniel took both her hands in his. "I have never been prouder of anyone in my life," he said softly. "You were magnificent tonight." "I couldn't have done any of this without you," Cora replied. "You gave me the courage to start over when I thought everything was lost." Daniel shook his head. "The courage was always yours, I just pointed the way." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket. "I had planned to wait until we returned to Copper Springs, but after tonight, this feels right." He withdrew a small velvet box, and Cora's breath caught in her throat. "Daniel, Cora Zimmerman," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring with a small diamond flanked by 2 sapphires. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. You have brought light and poetry and, yes, love into my world in ways I never thought possible again. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears welled in Cora's eyes as she looked from the ring to Daniel's face, so full of hope and love. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, with all my heart." The ring slid perfectly onto her finger, and when Daniel kissed her, there in the hallway of Tucson's grandest hotel, Cora felt as if her heart might burst with happiness. They returned to Copper Springs as heroes, Cora with her award and new status as a recognized writer, Daniel as the proud fiancé who had stood beside her through it all. The news of their engagement was met with genuine delight throughout the town, with Helena Bergman immediately beginning plans for a celebration. "Nothing too elaborate," Cora insisted when Helena suggested inviting the entire town. "Something simple, with just our closest friends." But in a community like Copper Springs, where everyone's survival depended on mutual support, the line between acquaintance and friend was fluid. In the end, it seemed most of the town turned out for the engagement party held in the hotel's dining room, which Helena and Otto had decorated with wildflowers and Chinese lanterns borrowed from the mining company's last celebration. As Cora and Daniel moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes, Sarah Blackburn pulled Cora aside for a moment of quiet conversation. "I've never seen Daniel so happy," Sarah said, her dark eyes warm with affection. "After what happened with Rebecca, many of us feared he would never open his heart again." "I know about Rebecca," Cora replied. "Daniel told me everything," Sarah nodded approvingly. "Good, no secrets then. That's the foundation of a strong marriage." She squeezed Cora's hand. "You know, when he first brought you to my shop, I had a feeling about you too. There was something in the way he looked at you, not just attraction, but recognition, as if he'd found something he hadn't known he was searching for." Across the room, Daniel was deep in conversation with Alexander Randall, the mining magnate who rarely visited Copper Springs in person but had arrived that morning, ostensibly on business, but with suspiciously perfect timing for the engagement celebration. "What do you think they're discussing so seriously?" Cora wondered aloud. Sarah followed her gaze. "If I had to guess, your future. Randall thinks highly of Daniel, and now that marriage is on the horizon, he'll want to ensure Daniel has a secure position." Indeed, later that evening, Daniel confirmed Sarah's prediction. "Randall has offered me a partnership in the ranch operations," he told Cora as they walked home under a canopy of stars. 10% ownership now, with the option to buy a larger share over time." "That's wonderful news," Cora exclaimed. "You deserve recognition for all your hard work." "There's more," Daniel said, a note of excitement in his voice. "He's also interested in your writing. The award has drawn attention to Copper Springs, which pleases him from a business perspective. He suggested funding a proper literary magazine for the territory with you as editor." Cora stopped walking, stunned by the magnitude of the opportunity. "A magazine for the entire territory?" Daniel nodded, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "Published quarterly at first, distributed to all the major settlements. Complete editorial freedom with a salary that would make your newspaper column seem like pocket change." "I don't know what to say," Cora breathed. "This is beyond anything I ever imagined." "Say yes," Daniel urged. "Your voice deserves to be heard far beyond Copper Springs. And selfishly, I like the idea of my wife being the most influential literary figure in the territory." "My wife." The words sent a thrill through Cora. In less than 6 months, she had gone from being banished from Gila Bend to becoming an award-winning writer, engaged to a man who supported her ambitions without reservation, with the prospect of a literary magazine under her guidance. When would this begin? She asked, practical considerations asserting themselves. After the wedding, Daniel replied. Randall suggests January for the first issue, which gives you time to secure contributors, design the format, and so on. As summer gave way to fall, preparations for both the wedding and the new magazine occupied most of Cora's time. She and Daniel set a date in November, allowing time for the construction of their new home, a wedding gift from Randall, built on a prime piece of land near the creek, larger than Daniel's bachelor cabin but designed with the same simple elegance. For the magazine, which they decided to call Copper Sky, a journal of Western literature and thought, Cora reached out to writers across the territory and beyond, including several women poets whose work she admired. To her delight, most responded enthusiastically, honored to be included in such a groundbreaking publication. The wedding day dawned clear and cool, with the desert air carrying just a hint of winter's approach. Sarah had created a wedding dress that made Cora gasp when she first saw it, ivory silk with delicate lace trim. Simple enough for a frontier ceremony, but elegant enough to make her feel like the heroine in one of her own poems. They were married in the small church on Front Street, with Reverend Thomas officiating and what seemed like the entire population of Copper Springs in attendance. Daniel, handsome in a new black suit, watched with undisguised adoration as Cora walked toward him on Otto Bergman's arm, the hotel keeper having volunteered to give away the bride in the absence of her parents. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but they had each written personal promises as well. Daniel's voice was steady as he recited the words he had composed for Cora. I promise to be your partner and your friend, to support your dreams as fervently as my own, to listen to your words with an open heart, and to love you through all the chapters of our story together. In you, I have found my home, and I will spend my life ensuring you never doubt your place in my heart. Cora's eyes glistened with tears as she offered her own promise. I pledge to walk beside you in all things, to bring poetry to our everyday moments, to face challenges with courage and celebration with joy. You found me when I was silenced and gave me the freedom to speak love every day. I will honor that gift by loving you fully and faithfully, today and always. The celebration afterwards spilled from the church to the hotel dining room and into the street, with music and dancing continuing well into the night. It was, as Helena Bergman later declared, the finest wedding Copper Springs has ever seen or is likely to see until one of you has children old enough to marry. That night, in their new home with its sturdy walls and wide windows overlooking the creek, Cora and Daniel began their life together as husband and wife. Their love, which had grown steadily through months of friendship and courtship, blossomed into a deeper intimacy, tender, passionate, and built on a foundation of mutual respect that promised to sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The first issue of Copper Sky appeared in January 1886, as planned. 500 copies were printed and distributed throughout the territory, and by the end of the month, requests for additional copies were pouring in from as far away as Denver and San Francisco. Cora's editorial vision, a mix of poetry, short fiction, thoughtful essays about frontier life, and profiles of noteworthy territory residents, struck a chord with readers hungry for material that reflected their experiences while elevating them beyond the daily struggle for survival. Her own column, now expanded from its newspaper origins, remained the heart of the publication. As winter gave way to spring, Cora and Daniel settled into the rhythms of married life. Their home became a gathering place for friends and visitors to Copper Springs, known for stimulating conversation, good food, as Daniel had continued to develop his cooking skills, and an atmosphere of warmth and welcome. In April, as they celebrated their 5-month anniversary with a private picnic in the hills above town, Cora shared news that would change their lives once again. I've been feeling rather peculiar in the mornings, she began, watching Daniel's face closely for his reaction. Doctor. Whitman confirmed my suspicions yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Daniel, in November around our first anniversary. Daniel's expression transformed from surprise to wonder to unabashed joy. He gathered Cora into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious porcelain. A baby, he whispered against her hair. Our baby. He pulled back to look into her eyes. Are you happy about this, with the magazine just beginning to flourish? I am beyond happy, Cora assured him. The magazine can continue perhaps with some adjustments to my schedule and maybe an assistant editor eventually, but this child. She placed his hand over her still flat stomach. This is a new kind of poetry we're creating together. When the news of Cora's pregnancy spread through Copper Springs, the community embraced it with characteristic enthusiasm. Sarah immediately began designing a layette. Helena promised to share her closely guarded recipes for remedies against morning sickness, and even the miners' wives, many of whom had birthed children in far less comfortable circumstances than Cora would face, offered practical advice and support. Throughout her pregnancy, Cora continued to work on the magazine, which had quickly become an important literary voice in the West. The summer and fall issues exceeded even the success of the first, with subscriptions now coming from as far east as Chicago and as far west as Portland. In her editorial for the fall issue, completed just weeks before her due date, Cora reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. A year ago, I stood before the town council of Gila Bend, condemned for speaking of love through my poetry. Today, I write to you from a home filled with love, in a community that has embraced not only my words but my very self, awaiting the birth of a child who will be raised to speak truth without fear. The frontier tests us in many ways, but perhaps its greatest gift is the opportunity to build communities that reflect our highest values rather than our deepest fears. In Copper Springs, I have found such a community, and through this magazine, I hope to extend its spirit to all who read these pages. Catherine Elizabeth Xavier was born on a cold, clear November morning, with Daniel pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door while Dr. Whitman and Helena Bergman assisted Cora through a difficult but ultimately successful delivery. She has your eyes, Cora whispered when Daniel was finally allowed to enter, cradling their daughter with a mixture of exhaustion and radiant joy. And I think she'll have your determination as well. She certainly wasn't in any hurry to make her entrance easy. Daniel sat carefully on the edge of the bed, one arm around Cora's shoulders, the other hand gently touching his daughter's downy head. She's perfect, he said, his voice thick with emotion, just like her mother. As Catherine grew from infant to toddler, Copper Springs continued to prosper. The mining company expanded its operations, bringing more families to the settlement, which now boasted a proper mayor, though not a formal council, to Cora's relief, a second hotel, and plans for a real theater. The magazine flourished as well, becoming influential enough that writers from as far away as New York occasionally submitted work, honored to be published in what one Eastern critic had called the most authentic literary voice of the American frontier. Cora managed to balance her roles as editor, wife, and mother with graceful determination, though not without occasional moments of exhaustion and frustration. Daniel proved to be an equal partner in parenthood, often bringing Catherine with him to the ranch office when Cora needed uninterrupted time for her writing. In the spring of 1888, when Catherine was almost a year and a half old and beginning to string together simple sentences, Cora and Daniel received an unexpected letter. It was addressed to both of them with a Boston postmark. Who do we know in Boston? Daniel wondered as he handed the envelope to Cora at the breakfast table. Cora opened it, her expression changing from curiosity to shock as she read the single page inside. It's from Rebecca, she said quietly. Rebecca Mason. Daniel froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. What does she want to visit? Cora replied, scanning the letter again. She says she's been following my work in Copper Sky, that it gave her the courage to begin writing again herself. She's published a children's book and has been commissioned to write articles about frontier settlements for a Boston magazine. She looked up at Daniel. She specifically mentions wanting to see you to apologize in person for how things ended. Daniel set down his cup, his expression unreadable. How do you feel about that? Cora considered the question carefully. There had been a time early in their relationship when the ghost of Rebecca Mason had seemed to hover between them. But those days were long past, their life together too solid, too real to be threatened by old memories. I think it might be good, she said finally, for both of you to have closure, and I admit to being curious about her writing. Daniel reached across the table to take her hand. Are you sure? I don't want to dredge up painful memories for either of us. I'm sure, Cora said firmly. Our life together is strong enough to withstand an encounter with your past. Besides, she added with a smile, I've always believed in the power of words to heal old wounds. Rebecca's visit, when it occurred in late summer, proved less dramatic than either Cora or Daniel had anticipated. The woman who stepped down from the stagecoach was not the passionate young schoolteacher Daniel had once loved, but a composed, professional writer with a quiet confidence that matched Cora's own. Over dinner at their home, with Catherine chattering happily in her high chair, the three adults found their way to an unexpectedly comfortable conversation about writing, the evolution of frontier settlements, and the changing attitudes toward women's voices in public discourse. What you've built here is remarkable, Rebecca told them as the evening drew to a close. Not just the magazine or your beautiful home, but the life you've created together. She smiled at Catherine, who was beginning to nod off despite her determination to stay awake. When I read your first column in Copper Sky, Cora, about being banished from Gila Bend for speaking of love, I recognized the pattern immediately. It was like looking into a mirror of my own past. That's why Daniel recognized what was happening to me, Cora said. He had seen it before with you. Rebecca nodded, her expression softening as she glanced at Daniel. I want you both to know that I don't regret how things turned out. I wasn't ready then to stand up for myself the way you did, Cora. I needed to go back east to find my own voice on my own terms. She reached for her handbag, withdrawing a small package. This is for Catherine, my book. Perhaps when she's older, she'll enjoy knowing that her parents inspired it in a way. After Rebecca's departure the next day, bound for other settlements to write about, Cora found Daniel standing on their porch, looking out over the creek in the fading light. Are you all right? She asked, slipping her arm around his waist. He turned to her, his eyes clear and present, no shadows of the past lingering there. More than all right, he said. Grateful, actually. For what? For how things worked out, for you, for Catherine, for all of it. He pulled her closer. Rebecca was part of my journey, and I'll always wish her well. But you, Cora Xavier, are my destination. As they stood together in the twilight, the sound of their daughter's laughter drifting through the open window behind them, Cora thought about the strange, winding path that had brought her to this moment, from the humiliation of banishment to the triumph of creating a life and work that reached far beyond the boundaries of any single town. They banished me for speaking love, she murmured, almost to herself. Daniel smiled, remembering their first real conversation outside Gila Bend's town hall. And I told you to speak it every day. The best advice I've ever received, Cora replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above Copper Springs. And I intend to follow it for the rest of our lives. In the years that followed, the Xavier family grew with the addition of a son, William Daniel, born in the summer of 1890. Copper Springs continued to thrive, evolving from a mining settlement into a proper town with amenities that would have seemed unimaginable when Cora first arrived. Copper Sky magazine became an institution in Western literary circles, providing a platform for emerging voices and established writers alike, always with Cora's distinctive editorial vision guiding its development. When the University of Arizona opened in Tucson in 1891, Cora was invited to give occasional lectures on frontier literature, adding teacher to her already impressive list of roles. Daniel's partnership in the ranch operations expanded to majority ownership when Alexander Randall decided to return east permanently in 1892, leaving the day-to-day management of his mining interests to trusted associates. The Xavier Ranch, as it came to be known, grew into one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory, known for innovative breeding practices and fair treatment of its workers. And throughout it all, Cora continued to write poetry about love in all its forms, about the beauty of the desert landscape, about the joy and challenges of building a life on the frontier. Her first collection, published in 1895 under the title Speaking Love, Poems from the Arizona Territory, received critical acclaim from Eastern literary establishments that had once dismissed Western writing as crude and unrefined. But perhaps her greatest achievement, as she often remarked to Daniel in their private moments, was the life they had created together, a partnership built on mutual respect and unwavering support, a family rooted in love and the freedom to speak truth, a community that valued the full spectrum of human experience. By the turn of the century, with Arizona moving toward statehood and Copper Springs established as a cultural center as well as a mining town, Cora and Daniel Xavier had become something of a legend in the territory, the cowboy and the poet who had found in each other not just love, but the courage to speak it every day, inspiring others to do the same. In the introduction to her second poetry collection, published in 1902, as Arizona prepared for its final push toward statehood, Cora reflected on the journey that had begun with banishment and led to belonging. When I was forced to leave Gila Bend in 1885, I believed I was being punished for the crime of speaking honestly about love in all its forms. What I could not have known then was that this apparent exile would lead me to a place where my voice would not only be tolerated but celebrated, where I would find a partner who encouraged me to speak love every day, and where together we would build a life that embodied the very principles I had been banished for expressing. The frontier has been called many things: harsh, unforgiving, the testing ground of American character. But it has also been a place of new beginnings where conventions can be questioned and communities formed around shared values rather than inherited traditions. In Copper Springs, I found such a community. In Daniel Xavier, I found a man whose vision of love matched my own, and in the life we have built together, I have found the greatest poetry of all, the daily verse of a family bound not by silence, but by truth freely spoken. And so, the story that began with banishment ended with belonging, with a love that had the courage to speak its name every day, changing not just two lives but an entire community in the process. For Cora and Daniel Xavier, the journey from that first meeting outside Gila Bend's town hall to their life together in Copper Springs proved that even in the wildest places, the human heart finds ways to express its deepest truths if only given the freedom to speak.